Welcome to the Ayona Show, where we'll get the real headlines with none of the mercy. Coming live out of Washington, D.C. Now, tonight we're going to speak to Gary Weiss about jobs numbers and his new book, AYN RAND Nation. We see if her philosophy echoed the movements and the words and actions of Republican lawmakers. Well, we do see it there, but what would really happen if they were allowed to take it all the way? Then the U.S. dollars worth of customer cash. It's an unfair world. We get that. But how much worse could it be if one philosophy really took root? Well, joining me from our studio in New York is Gary Weiss, columnist and author of AYN RAND Nation, The Hidden Struggle for America's Soul. Gary, thanks so much for joining us tonight. And I guess first off, let's just go back to these jobs numbers that we got for the month of February. If you had to break it down, what's your takeaway?
Well, my takeaway is that things are getting better, but as you point out, there was a terrible decline in the number of public sector jobs. And, public sector is going to continue to be under attack. And it's going to help keep unemployment high. And that might endanger Obama's chances of re-election,
But do you think that we might start seeing that slow down? Like I mentioned last year, 22,000 jobs a month were being shed from the public sector. Seems like that's kind of petering out for now.
It seems to be, but I think that the public sector is going to continue to be under attack. It's become very politicized. And as a result of, I think, largely, as I point out in my book, as largely a result of the radical right and Ayn Rand, you see an unprecedented attack on the public sector, on teachers. We're not talking about waste jobs necessarily. We're talking about teachers. We're talking about policemen. We're talking about essential government services are under attack, really for the first time in many, many years, first time since the Depression, and it's not going to help the recovery at all.
All right, well, so let's
because the private sector is not taking up the slack.
Yeah, it's not picking up the slack, but so let's talk about what you argue here in your book, right, where you call it AYN RAND Nation. And so why is it that you think, though, that this is taking such hold right now, right? I think that you can say that we have maybe a growing group of libertarians in the country. You also see the Tea Party embrace this in certain respects. You have a lot of fiscal conservatives in the Republican Party now that are trying to take it far. But why specifically now is this, so strong?
Well, I think to a large extent it's a result of sort of a massive rewriting of history. A lot of people have become convinced by the radical right, influenced largely by Ayn Rand, that the reason that we had a financial crisis, the reason that there's such hardship, is because of government. People aren't believing, what are the true facts, which have been established, which is that it's the private sector, it's the banking industry that caused the financial crisis of 2008 and the resulting recession. It's private sector that brought this down upon us, not government. And I think people are believing the nonsense that they're taught by the radical right, by the Ron Paul types, by the libertarians, and by the Republican Party. That's really all that it comes down to, I think. And that's where Ayn Rand comes in, because as I call her in the book, she is the Marx, the Karl Marx of the radical right.
And so, keeping that in mind, too, let's look at this Government Accountability Office report that I just mentioned that shows us that, what was it? I forgot the exact number now. Somehow I lost it. But so many of these banks were actually repaying the bailout money they got from the taxpayers by just taking money from other federal programs. And every day I feel like I say, it just can't get any more outrageous. Yesterday we were talking about Bank of America and the fact that a whistleblower came out and said that they were actually not giving people their loan modifications and misleading them, while at the same time partaking in the government's program in HAMP and passing on just enough modifications so they could still let it slide. And then you have this report. How much more outrageous can it get?
It's an absolute outrage. And, that's the irony here. That's the real irony here, is that the bailout was necessary by the actions of the private sector, by the banking industry, made this bailout necessary. And the bailout was a terrible thing. And the Randers and the radical right, they're saying, oh, this bailout was the government. It was the government coming in. And then all the bad stuff that you see coming out of the TARP program, such as what came out today, about how they're borrowing from Peter to pay Paul. They're saying, that's the fault of the government. But what it really comes down to is the original reason we're having this bailout was the private sector. That's what it came down to. It's the banking industry running out of control, and I think the public is losing sight of that.
Yeah, but as you mentioned, too, one of the arguments that we hear from these Randers, if that's what you want to call them, is that some of this is rooted in basic, fundamental American values of individuality, of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps.
Oh, absolutely. There's just no question. I mean, I think that one of the reasons why, apart from the rewriting of history, and one of the reasons why Rand appeals to people is she sort of popularized notions which I think are already pretty deeply rooted in the American culture. Individuality, good things. You have to admit that there are good aspects to her philosophy. And I think if you read her novels and read her philosophy a certain way, there's a lot you can get out of it that's good. I mean, people aren't stupid. I mean, there's good stuff in her philosophy, but the overall point of her philosophy is to promote very radical capitalism that is basically out of control. And we've seen in this country what happens when capitalism runs out of control. I mean, we're living with the side effects right now, with the after effects.
What else is interesting too that you talk about is the fact that this is one of those. Ayn Rand's books are books that everyone reads while they're in high school, maybe when they're in college, and then if you look at the way that some of these things are being applied, if you look at the GOP candidates right now that are running for president, they're not going to touch Social Security or Medicaid or Medicare because they know that they need the elderly population because those are the voters. And yet at the same time, if you flip it over and if you look at the way that they're trying to address the younger population, the issues of education, of student loan debt, they're basically saying, fight for yourself.
Oh yeah. There's just no question about that. They're basically they're all over the lot on these things. The emphasis that they're basically trying to do. They're attacking these social programs. They can really do that for the first time since Goldwater because the radical right has pushed them far to the right. The Tea Party and the radical right, influenced by Rand, has pushed them to the far right. But that's a recipe for not being elected. They're not going to be elected by the public because the population, the people don't really want that. They want their Medicare. Ayn Rand was on Medicare when she passed away in 1982. She and her husband were on Medicare. I mean, even Rand people need these programs. That's the irony.
Now, lastly, I want to go back to another little tidbit that I threw in at the top of the interview, which is that MF Global, some of the executives there, despite the fact that they've misplaced about $2 billion worth of customer money, a lot of these executives are actually still there on top. They got to keep their jobs, not to mention they're now still hoping to get these massive bonuses, which are, or maybe not as massive as some of the ones that we see, Jamie Dimon get, but still hundreds of thousands of dollars worth. And, on what planet is that okay? Do you think that there's some kind of a victim complex that we see coming from Wall Street? We saw that piece from Bloomberg where they were complaining that they had to choose between selling their Ferrari or their street bike and how hard it is to be rich.
Yeah. You do see that. You see that there's this whining that's coming out of Wall Street. They feel that they're being put upon, they're being criticized. We see that MF Global is kind of it's kind of an outlier because, in order to wind up the bankruptcy, in order to sort out the big mess that John Corzine left, it was necessary to keep on some of these employees, some of these top executives, to sort out the mess that the private sector created. So as a result of which, they now they did a good job, so they're going to pay them a bonus to sort out the mess. It's almost kind of funny when you think about it.
Funny yet sad, I guess, for the rest of us that are looking at the jobs numbers, and for so many of those Americans that are unemployed and continue to be. Gary, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.